I'll call to order the Santa Barbara City Council Finance Committee meeting for May 1st. Is there anyone in the audience who'd like to speak to any items that are not on our agenda today? Seeing no one, we'll go to the item that's on our agenda, the General Fund Major Revenues and Multi-Year Forecast. Mr. Samario or Ms. Nemes?
No, I'll start.
Okay.
Bob Samario, Finance Director. So just to give you some context, this report is related to the recent filing of the fiscal year 19 recommended budget with Council. And as you know, the Finance Committee will be reviewing certain parts of it. And so this is the first substantive item we have for the Finance Committee over the next few weeks. And we always start with general fund revenues, and then we use that to build our multi-year forecast. So it'll be a sort of a two-part presentation. Ms. Julie Nemes, our Treasury Manager, will be starting with the revenues. And it's important, and we want to make sure you're comfortable with our assumptions. But you know, we make a lot of assumptions this year, how we're going to end the year, which become the basis for the next year. And the revenues are the most important part of the budget. It tells you how much you have to spend, and it drives a lot of our decisions. So we want to make sure that you're comfortable with our assumptions. And then just for informational purposes, we'll again go into a multi-year forecast looking all the way through 2021, what the trends are looking like based on our assumptions of revenues and costs. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Nemes.
Thank you, Mr. Samario. I am Julie Nemes. I'm the Treasury Manager for the Finance Department, and I will be covering the General Fund Major Revenue Forecast for fiscal year 2019. I'll be going over a couple different areas today. I'll be starting with just a summary of the non-departmental revenues for fiscal year 17, 18, and 19. Then I'll be going into the detailed revenues for sales tax, property tax, transient occupancy tax, utility users tax, franchise fees, business license, and property transfer tax. I'll be going over, as Mr. Samario mentioned, the assumptions, what we use to create our forecast, and looking for any input from all of you. So this beginning slide is a summary of our general fund non-departmental revenues. It shows the FY17 actuals, and that's in yellow. In orange is FY18, and that is our adopted budget, our revised forecast for FY18, and then the variance between the adopted budget and the revised forecast. And in purple is the FY19 budget, which is our proposed budget, the reforecast for FY19, and then the variance between the two. What I wanted to point out is that these are all of our major revenues. For FY18, we have a revised forecast that is creating a variance of $576,000 below the adopted budget. This is almost entirely due to sales tax, and I'll be getting into the details on future slides. Sales tax and TOT continues to perform a little bit below our expectations, whereas property tax and UUT is performing a little bit better than our expectations in FY18. For FY19, the reforecast is actually better than the original proposed budget. We are forecasting $91 million, which results in a positive variance of $300,000, and it's following the same trends that we saw in fiscal year 18. Sales tax and TOT has gotten a little soft, whereas property tax and UUT is performing a little bit better than we had originally budgeted. So moving on to the detailed revenues, the first being sales tax. Sales tax is our second largest revenue source. For fiscal year 18, we did have a lower base going into 18 because when we adopt a budget every year, we only have 2 quarters worth of data to review when we adopt the budget. Sales tax is received quarterly and 1 quarter in arrears. So we did not have the March or June quarters at the time of adopting the budget for FY18. So the final quarters of fiscal year 17 did come in lower than we had anticipated. This does result in additional growth needed in the final 2 quarters of FY18 to meet the adopted budget. So that just basically means we start with a lower base already in FY18. I also wanted to point out that we did see an impact in the second quarter from the Thomas Fire. The first quarter was pretty close to budget, and I'll have a slide that shows the numbers. The second quarter, we did see a decline from largely due to the Thomas Fire. Based on the Thomas Fire mudslide, we are revising our projection for the remaining 2 quarters. We are projecting a decrease of about $250,000. That's our estimate of the impact for the remaining 2 quarters from those 2 disasters. The net effect of all of these results in a projected revenue decrease of close to $1 million. It's about $925,000 from adopted budget. For FY19, we are recommending to reduce the growth rate from 2%, which was in the original proposed budget for FY19, to 1.5%. We're doing this because we've seen low quarterly returns for the past several years. For the last 6 quarters, there's only been one quarter that has achieved a 2% growth rate. So we're recommending this reduction. Also, we are treating the Thomas Fire and mudslide results as one-time impacts. So the results for the December quarter that were down about 5%, and I'll show you that on the next slide, and also that $250,000 adjustment that we made for the remaining 2 quarters of fiscal year 18, we're treating those as one-time impacts. So the sales tax forecast for FY19 assumes revenues will return to pre-disaster levels. We have also factored in any new businesses into the revised forecast for FY19. So taking into account all of those factors and assumptions, our revised revenue forecast results in a decrease of about $390,000. So looking at all of that data together gives you this chart showing FY17 in yellow. It shows the actual results and the actual growth rate. In orange, similar to the first chart we looked at, is the FY18 adopted budget, the reforecast and the revised growth rate, and in purple is FY19, the revised forecast and the revised growth rate. At the bottom in green, you'll notice we have a variance between FY18 revised and FY19 revised to the adopted and proposed budgets for both years. I've also shown you in green at the bottom what the original adopted growth rate is. So I wanted to point out for FY18, the September 30th quarter, the actual results resulted in 1.3% growth, which was pretty close to our growth rate, our adopted growth rate. However, for December 31st, that quarter, you'll notice it was a decline of 5.6%. We think that was largely attributed to the Thomas Fire. And in the remaining 2 quarters, you'll notice the grayish blue shading. Those are forecasts, whereas in the white are actual results. So for the March 31st quarter and the June 30th quarter in FY18, that's where we have included that $250,000 adjustment for the remainder of the year. In total, the FY18 reforecast is $924,000 below the adopted budget. Then in FY19, we have revised that growth rate from 2% to 1.5%. You'll notice below the September 30th quarter, the growth rates all seem a lot higher than 1.5%. That's because we used those pre-disaster revenue levels and did not factor in that quarter from December 31st in FY18 or the $250,000 that we factored in quarter 3 and quarter 4 from FY18. So they show as bigger growth rates, even though it is a 1.5% of pre-disaster revenue levels. Does that make sense?
Councilmember Dominguez.
That mostly makes sense. The one question I wanted to get a clarification on, so under the yellow column, fiscal year actual, the December quarter, there's negative 1.3% growth. Is that year to year?
That is year to year. That's December, the prior, so it'd be fiscal year 16 December quarter to fiscal year 17 December quarter, that 3-month period.
Okay, and then the June quarter, that's ending June 30th?
Correct.
Is a negative 2.7?
Correct.
And do we have any idea? That seems like a pretty big drop, that 2.7. Was there something, what was the explanation back then, if you remember?
I believe that quarter did have some one-time adjustments in it. I don't know if, I do have Diego Martin here from Treasury, and I'm not sure if he recalls, but I believe that quarter did have some one-time adjustments.
Yeah, there certainly were some one-time adjustments in the June quarter. I think December was more just general retail activity being a little down than where it was the prior year. But June, there was some kind of one-time shifts. I believe so. Got closer. Is that better? Okay. So, yes, there's some, and what we mean by kind of one-time things is where a company might be late in submitting, so they might report 2 quarters worth of income in 1 quarter, or some kind of readjustments in kind of the location of their business. I'm not completely sure what the exact reasons were for that one, but there were some large kind of one-time transfers in that quarter.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then the green adopted growth rate on the very bottom of 1%. Does that refer back up to the forecasted 21 million, or is that, what is that 1% adopted growth rate?
So that was the original FY18 adopted growth rate that that developed that adopted budget number, the 21.9 million, the very left column under the orange.
Okay, so the 21,936 was 1% above the actual or the forecast 2017?
Above the FY17 actuals at the time we adopted the budget. It was the forecast of FY17 at the time we adopted the budget. So
Okay.
the data we had at the time we adopted budget.
And so what would be the revised growth rate? It would actually be not negative growth. It would be some percentage because of the 21,378, or going back to the forecasted rate.
So our the revised growth rate, so you'll see is 21,012 is compared to FY17 actuals, where we actually ended the year. So if you wanted to look at it at the time that we actually adopted the budget, I don't have that data there. It was a different number. You're right. At the time we adopted the budget, we then go and look at the revised growth at the time based on where FY17 ended up.
So the 1.7 there, the negative 1.7, that's calculated from the actual with our forecast?
Correct. It's based on FY17 actuals.
And just to add, so the 1% is what we, based on what we forecast in 17, what we budgeted in 18. But because 17 came in lower, in order to meet budget in 18, just the budgeted amount, we need more than 1%.
Great.
Exactly. Yeah, we started with a lower base because you'll notice the last two quarters of FY17 only showed a growth of 0.4 and a negative 2.7. So we actually had to grow more than 1% to meet the adopted budget in FY18.
And then the fiscal year 2019 budget, that 4.6% revised growth, that's 4.6 above the fiscal year 2018
Fiscal year 2018 reforecast.
reforecast. So that's the 21,012 number.
Correct.
Okay.
And again, the reason it's so high is because we've assumed that it's starting in 19, we go back to the pre-disaster numbers. So I mean, treating what's happening this year as one time. And so that brings us up pretty substantially. Then on top of that, we would add 1.5% to our assumed growth above that base.
So comparing it to 2017, it's about 600,000 more than 2017's actual. And so that would be somewhere 2.5% growth from 2017. Okay.
Yes, over a 2-year period, yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So just the last thing I wanted to say on this was just for FY19, the net reforecast results in about $390,000 below the original proposed budget. I'll move on to a little more data on sales tax. We'd like to show a historical chart on sales tax just to show some trends and what we've seen over the last 9 years. This is data from 2011 through 2019. In 2011, the city received $17.6 million in sales tax. In orange are all actual results, green is the forecast. In 2017, the city received $21.4 million. In 2018, we're projecting $21 million, and in 2019, $22 million. What I wanted to point out is that in between 2011 and 2015, you'll notice that it was a pretty decent growth rate for those years. It averaged about 5% growth. However, between 2016 and 2018, we're looking at only between 2017 and 2019, we're only looking at about a 3% growth rate. The 2018 number forecast does include that Thomas Fire and mudslide impact, so that's why you see a 1.9% decline. However, even without that impact, you'll notice that sales taxes are just not performing the way they were about 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago.
Councilmember Friedman.
With the increases that we're projecting, does that include Measure C as part of it?
That's a great question. No, I have not included the Measure C money in this chart or in any of the tables. That's completely separate because they're not. It won't be general fund. But it's pretty close to. It's almost a 1-to-1. It's just slightly higher than the general fund portion. Moving on to property taxes. Property taxes is the largest revenue source, non-departmental general fund revenue source for the city. In fiscal year 18, we did revise our projection based on county valuation reports we received that assessed values had an increase of 6%. Our original adopted budget growth rate was 5.5%. That is primarily secured and unsecured taxes. We have other things that are components of property taxes that might impact that growth rate, but it is a large portion of our property taxes. We were also informed by the county that we had a one-time Thomas Fire impact of $190,000. The ongoing impact is less than 0.1%, less than $20,000, so it's pretty minimal. Based on this data, we are projecting a revenue increase of about $414,000 from adopted budget in FY18. For FY19, we are recommending a change to our growth rate from 5% to 5.5%. This is largely due to the last several years, our growth rate has exceeded 5.5%. We continue to see healthy growth in property taxes, both statewide, locally, nationally. The housing market continues to perform very well. Locally, inventory is very low, turnover is very quick, and we are continuing to see Prop 8 recapture, which is basically the properties that were assessed down during the housing crisis. The county can then recapture those values at any time. They can do it quickly or slowly, and they've done it very conservatively, and there are still values to be recaptured. We believe it could end in 19 or 20. It usually counts for about 1% of growth, so we still have about 1% of growth for Prop 8 recapture. We also see about 2 to 3% for new development, so we believe that 5.5% is a healthy growth rate for FY19. Based on the change in the growth rate and the higher growth in FY18, we are revising our revenue forecast, and that results in an additional $786,000 in revenues in FY19. This chart is very similar to the other one for sales tax. It shows FY17 results, FY18 forecast, and FY19 forecast, as well as the variance to the adopted and proposed budget. I wanted to point out the numbers I've already provided, but for FY18, with the additional data we received from the county, even with the Thomas Fire adjustment, you'll notice towards the bottom of the FY18 columns that one-time Thomas Fire adjustment of $190,000. We are still projecting revenues to come in above budget of $414,000. And for FY19, we are recommending a change to our growth rate from 5% to 5.5%. Which is going to result in additional revenues of $787,000, and that's due to having the higher base from better results in FY18 and that revised growth rate.
Councilmember Friedman.
Just a question on actually wrong tax. I'll come back to you.
Okay, absolutely. So historical look at property taxes. I used the same time period, 2011 through 2019. In 2011, we did have $22.8 million in property taxes received by the city. In 2017, $29.4 million was received, and we're forecasting in 2019 about $32.6 million. What's interesting about property taxes is in 2011 through 2015, we didn't see the growth. That was when we had the housing crisis, when the properties were actually being assessed down or just starting to come back from being assessed down. It is in recent times we're starting to see more improved growth in property taxes. And over the last several years, we are seeing growth rates exceeding 5%. You'll notice in 2018, we do have it at 4.4% growth rate, and that was slightly impacted by that one-time Thomas Fire adjustment. Over 9 years, we do show almost a $10 million increase in property taxes. So this is one of our healthiest revenue sources for the city. Next is transient occupancy tax. For fiscal year 18, we did revise our projection based on actual results through February 2018. In FY18, we had included Hotel Californian for the entire year. However, there was a 2-month delay, which impacted results for FY18. We also are recommending to revise our projection due to the Thomas Fire and mudslide. In December and January, we had some pretty significant variances in our results, and I'll be going over that in a few minutes. But we felt that for the remaining 4 months of the fiscal year that there could be some lingering impacts from the Thomas Fire and mudslide on our local hotels and lodging establishments. So we are recommending a reduction in our growth rate from 3% to 2% just for those remaining 4 months. So based on the data that we've received through February and that adjustment to our growth rate, we are projecting a revenue decrease of about $83,000. Moving on to fiscal year 19. At this time, we're not recommending any change to the hotel motel growth rate of 3%. The Thomas Fire and mudslide results in December and January, we're similar to how we treated it with sales tax. We are treating those as one-time impacts. When we get to the next chart, I'll show you they're pretty significant variances of over 20%. So we are treating those as one-time impacts, and we're not including them in the FY19 forecast. So we are FY19 forecast assumes revenues will return to pre-disaster levels just for December and January. However, we will use the the March through June adjusted base of the lower growth rate from 3% to 2% for our FY19 forecast. The opening and expansion of any hotels and motels has already been factored into the forecast as additional growth above the 3%. However, we have made some slight modifications based on additional data that we've received for this year and for FY19 from the community and from local lodging establishments. Based on all of this information, we are revising our revenue forecast, and it results in about a $142,000 decrease from FY19. So this is a little small. I'm sorry. I tried to make it as big as possible. We look at our data on a monthly basis because that's how we receive TOT. You'll see that for FY18, based on the results all the way through February and the revision to our growth rate from 3% to 2%, we are projecting revenues to come in about $83,000 below budget. On this slide, I did want to point out in fiscal year 18, under the orange section, the results for December and January, you'll notice, are pretty big variances. December was down 27%, and January is up 20%. We do believe that's largely impacted by the Thomas Fire and by the mudslide. We think the positive variance could be due to residents being displaced and having to stay in local lodging establishments. So that is why we've treated those as one-time impacts for our FY19 reforecast. So based on the assumptions that we've provided for FY19, it results in a $142,000 decrease below our proposed budget for FY19. And you'll notice for December and January why there's such a big variance there, because we went to pre-disaster revenue levels. Any questions on this before I move on? Okay, great. Thank you. Historically, TOT revenues prior to the last couple of years have performed very well. This is the data from 2011 through 2019. Back in 2011, the city earned $12.5 million in TOT. In 2017, the city earned $19.2 million, and we are forecasting the city to receive $19.8 million in 2019. Once again, you'll notice similar to sales tax, from 2011 to 2015, the TOT was performing very well. We saw several years of double-digit growth. However, over the last couple of years, we are not seeing the same level of performance. Whether or not it's just starting to level off or it's reached a ceiling, we know that our hotels, our occupancy rate is very high. So whether it's reached a point where most of the growth is related to growth in prices, we think that's a possibility. We also know that 2018 obviously had some impacts from the Thomas Fire and mudslide. Over the last 9 years, we've seen about a growth of about $7 million in TOT. So that's why we've recommended some lower growth rates for TOT for FY19 compared to what we were seeing a few years ago. The next revenue is utility user taxes. In fiscal year 18, we also have data on a monthly basis, so we revised our projection based on data through February 2018. We are not recommending any changes to the growth rates. The individual growth rates do vary, and so we're seeing the biggest declines, as we have for the last couple of years, in cellular. We're also seeing the biggest growth in water. Based on the year-to-date results through February, UUT is performing well. Water and electric are performing well, so we're projecting a revenue increase of about 107,000 over adopted budget in FY18. For FY19, we are recommending one change. We're recommending an increase to the growth rate for refuse from 4% to 8%, and that is consistent with staff's recommendation of an increase to solid waste rates for FY19. The overall growth rate for FY19 for all of our utilities is increased from 0.2 to 0.7%. We are assuming a continued decline in cellular, telephone, and cable. It's what we've seen for a couple of years now. We're seeing people actually move away from traditional cellular and move towards prepaid cellular. And luckily in 2016, the city started to receive UUT on prepaid cellular. So that's an area of growth for the city. It does assume growth in all other categories except electric that we've kept flat, with the largest growth rates in refuse and water. So based on this data, we are revising our forecast, and it will result in additional revenues of $150,000. Looking at all of the data, this shows the individual reforecast and growth rates for all of our utility users' taxes. And you'll see that we subtotal telephone, which is comprised of cellular, voice over internet protocol, telephone, and prepaid cellular. The very bottom one is prepaid cellular, is one that's new to us since 2016. And it's pretty much the only one that is consistently growing at this point, as we see customers moving away from traditional landline and traditional cellular towards prepaid cellular. Cable continues to decline, and however, we do see growth in electric. SCE did have a rate increase in FY18, which is why I think we have the growth in FY18, and we had budgeted for it. Gas, it really varies year to year. And refuse, we've seen a growth along with pricing, with rate increases, as well as water. So overall, our revised projection shows an increase of 107,000 for FY18. And for FY19, the one change is related to refuse, where we're increasing the growth rate from 4% to 8%. And that results in additional revenues of 150,000, partly due to refuse and partly due to the higher results in FY18. I'm going to be going into the final few revenues, but I won't be going into as much detail. They're not as big of a revenue source for the city. So the first being franchise fees. The revised projection is based on results through December 2017. We are recommending no changes to growth rates in FY18. Based on data through December 2017, we are projecting a revenue increase of 24,000. This is primarily from electric performing better, both at the end of FY17 and in 18. For FY19, the growth rate, we are recommending an increase in the growth rate for refuse similar to UUT from 4% to 8%. And this results in a revised revenue forecast of 44,000 over the proposed budget in FY19. For business license, the revised projection is based on results through February 2017, as this is received monthly. We do think it's possible that we're seeing some Thomas Fire and mudslide impacts to business licenses. We're seeing a decline this year, and we think it's possible that businesses either may have gone out of business or are deciding not to continue to operate, and we're not receiving the applications for business license renewals like we anticipated. We also do have some staffing impacts. We have some turnover in our Treasury division, which impacts the ability to follow up on delinquent notices as often as we usually do. And so businesses that are delinquent, we generally call and ask, are you no longer operating in the city of Santa Barbara, or are you just behind on making the payment? So it's possible some of this decline is just late payments as opposed to no longer renewing. Based on the data through February 2017, we are projecting a revenue decrease of 70,000 from adopted budget. In FY19, we are recommending a reduction in the growth rate from 1% to 0%, just based on the data we have through February of 2017. And this results in a revised revenue forecast of a 101% decrease for FY19. For property transfer tax, which just a reminder of what this is. So anytime a property is sold, There is a tax that it equates to $1.10 for every $1,000 of assessed value, and the city gets 50% of that. It's very difficult to estimate because it's based on sales activity, and one very large purchase can have a significant impact on this revenue line. So right now, we are not recommending any change to the FY 18 and 19 growth rate of 3%, but it is coming in slightly below our budget. However, like I mentioned, that one big sale could have us meet budget in FY 18 or 19. It's just really hard to predict. But based on data through I think it's February, the projected revenue, we're projecting revenues being below budget of $43,000 in FY 18 and $45,000 in FY 19. So this last chart is a summary of all three of those revenues: franchise fees, business license, and property transfer tax. Even though I summed the three revenues, they are not related, but just to look at them in totality. So for the three for FY 18, in total, we are projecting the variance to the adopted budget below adopted budget of $90,000. Franchise fees are performing better than anticipated. However, business license and property transfer tax are slightly below where we anticipated, slightly below budget for FY 18. For FY 19, it's a very similar story. Franchise fees are performing better than we predicted, whereas business license and property transfer tax are slightly behind budget. So the net effect is about $102,000 below the proposed budget. So now that we went through all the details, I thought it'd be helpful just to go back one more time and look at the summary of revenues in case there's any questions. And it gives you a good idea of where FY 17 ended up, where FY 18 will be, and where FY 19 is being forecast. So you'll notice that for FY 17, the revenues came in at about $86.2 million. For FY 18, based on all of the assumptions we went through, we are reforecasting revenues to come in at $87.4 million. For FY 19, we're actually projecting revenues to come in slightly above the original proposed budget at $91 million. For a variance of $303,000 in FY 19. So I'm happy to answer any questions before I move on, before I pass it off to Mr. Samario for the multi-year.
Any questions? Councilmember Dominguez?
Thank you. So this last slide you just showed us, so the reforecast number is 91 million. So that's a pretty significant difference from fiscal year 2017's actual. Looks like close to 5 million. Do you know what that is in terms of a percent?
I know that
Looks like 3 or 4% maybe.
FY 19 is a 3.2% growth over FY 18 forecast, and FY 18, I believe, is a 1.4. So what is that for? I think it's about 5%.
About 5%.
Did I do the math right?
Yeah.
I think
It's
it's
a
about
$5 million increase in roughly $100 million order of magnitude.
Yeah, it's maybe a little less than 5%.
So, and I'm just thinking about that in terms of 2 years growth, ignoring kind of the one-time impacts of the Thomas Fire. So that seems like roughly in the ballpark, particularly with a big property tax engine driving this. In terms of the property tax and the Thomas Fire, how did that play out? You said there was a one-time impact. Is that because of properties on Coast Village Road, or where would that impact the city?
Yeah, it should be mostly the properties on Coast Village Road, because that should be the only properties within the city limits.
And those are property owners who've filed paperwork to reduce their property taxes?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we got that information, and I'm not sure if the county assessor just did the reassessments on their own. There's different ways that they can do reassessments. They can do them at the request of a property owner, or they can do it themselves. They can initiate it. So I'm not sure what direction they took on this one.
Okay. And is the city eligible either through insurance or federal government assistance to recoup any of that lost revenue?
We are not able to recover that through FEMA or OES. Any lost revenues, only any actual cost that we incurred, damages incurred.
Or insurance?
Insurance, there's a possibility that, and we're pursuing that they're based on where the damage occurred and the nexus to lost revenues. We have to meet certain thresholds. We may be able to see some recovery of lost revenues. But but not for things such as sales taxes and those kind of things. It'd be more like in the waterfront, any lost revenues from rents or facilities that weren't able to be rented because of that.
Is there a ballpark number amongst all the revenue sources in terms of how much was lost because of the Thomas Fire?
No, we haven't kind of quantified that.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Friedman?
My question, I'm not sure if it has to do with the general fund, but I'll start there. In 2 weeks, we have for the council the issue of the library. And when the county action to cap the administrative fees, my understanding is that's going to have an impact in a couple $100,000 range. Is that part of general fund, or is that part of a categorical or a fund? And the reason I ask is I see this $303,000 variance for next fiscal year, and my understanding, and again, we haven't had that item yet, but the library is going to be a significant chunk, so I want to see if that accounts for it, if it's accounted in another type of accounting mechanism.
Committee Member Friedman, so the impact is going to be to the general fund of the couple $100,000 or so, and that's because we charge the county library fund a separate fund for those services, and it comes into the general fund, the library department. So that is an impact to the library department, general fund. But going into 19, we have a balanced budget, but we haven't factored in how we address that unbalanced amount. So we're really technically out of balance by that amount. So this $300,000 is already factored into that equation.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's turn it over to, let's talk about multi-year forecast. So this is just a recap of what Ms. Nemes just went through for 18 and 19. And the purpose of this is to kind of give you a sense of how it's looking, what are the assumptions we're building into a multi-year forecast. And we do this every year. We're always updating this. Sometimes we go out further, but 2 years out is about as far as I like to go, where it's meaningful to us because there's so many variables. But I wanted to highlight what I've assumed in this multi-year forecast in these major revenue categories. So starting with sales taxes, in 2020, the blue column, you'll see that I've assumed a continuation of the assumption that we built into the 19 budget of 1.5% for the 2 out years. So 1.5% in 2020 and an additional 1.5% in 2021. We think that's a reasonable assumption. I think that there is potential, short of any recession, for an upward pressure, or to be that higher, because I think CPI is starting to grow, and as CPI grows, prices of goods and services by definition go up, and we can see some increases there. But based on what we're seeing now, and still sort of the impacts of the Amazon and all that, we think 1.5% per year is a reasonable number for forecasting at least. We are keeping the 5% in the out years for property taxes. Ms. Nemes indicated that the 1% of that we're seeing now is from property recapture. That could run out in 19 at a minimum 20. So we think 5% growth in those 2 years is a reasonable amount or number. And then you'll see for the first time showing up in 2020 $1 million, and this is property taxes. So when the RDA was dissolved back in 2011 or 12, we were allowed to continue to receive property tax increment, in order to pay off existing RDA bonds. There are 2 bonds that are outstanding, issued in 2001 and 3, and those will be fully retired in 2019. And it's about $7 or $8 million that we are receiving in order to pay for these bonds. Once that is completed, then that money will be reapportioned, just like the rest of it was, to all the taxing jurisdictions. And we are one of the jurisdictions within the project area, if you will, and our share of that is 13%, which works out to be about $1 million. So we'll start to see $1 million roughly in 2020, and then we're expecting to see that grow along with property taxes. It'll be folded into our property tax number, and so it should grow about 5%. So it's kind of a nice, boon for us, and that started in that year. With TOT, we're assuming 3% in the out years. Just don't know. That's such a tough one to forecast. But to be kind of in line with what we're thinking now, what we're seeing now, we think 3% are good numbers. Could be better, could be worse. Don't know. It's sort of a good mid-range number. Utility users tax, business license tax, are always in the 1% range, so we're going to be consistent with that. And then real property transfers tax, they're not necessarily tied to property taxes. They're almost a leading indicator, but we've seen kind of an average of 3% growth per year on that. and that's what we're sticking with. Not a big number in any case. But to kind of go to Mr. Dominguez's kind of question about overall growth, just for the tax revenues in 18, it's going to be at a 1.3% growth overall relative to 17. Of course, that factors into Thomas Fire. And then 19, a 4.4% overall growth. A little bit, it's higher because of the fact that we assume some of that one-time stuff is going to come back to normal 19. But, you know, if you were to normalize that stuff, we're looking at a 2 to 3% overall growth in taxes over a couple of years. In 20, the only reason we're looking at 4.3 is because of that $1 million coming in for the first time, but otherwise it would be more in the 3% range. Any questions on that?
Councilmember Dominguez.
Yes, thank you. On the property tax, do you know where Santa Barbara's property values are relative to the past peak? I know we dropped down several years ago, and we've been climbing back up on it here once in a while. Some communities have caught up. Do you know where we are? And I know property tax revenue tends to lag behind that curve, so I'm just curious if we've caught up.
A good question. I'm not sure I have the answer, but from an assessed value perspective, we're not back to where we were. Otherwise, we wouldn't see it. We wouldn't have that capacity to be for the Prop 8 recapture. So I think from an assessed value perspective, what they call Prop 13 value, I think we're still below. In terms of market values, I think we're, median prices are at or above where we were back pre-recession. And Ms. Demas can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
That's accurate.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, that's accurate.
So a lot of detail here, but just the idea is to kind of show you, wrapping in not only in taxes, but the other revenues that are part of the general fund. There are a number of them. You can see the taxes by far the largest category, so I summed them all together. What we just went over. Some of the other large revenues we have in the general fund include service charges. That's kind of about halfway into the revenue section, 11.9 million in 18, 12.1 million in 2020 in 19. Those are charges for services like planning, building, recreation services. They represent about 10 or so % of our overall general fund revenue total. But on a percentage basis, not big, but in terms of dollars, they are important to us. And I know Mr. Hart knows this, or community member Hart knows this, but a while ago we made a point to consistently raise our fees every year to try to keep up with the cost of providing those services. We're not able to always keep up, but we do our best. There are other considerations such as market participation where we might lose if we raise them too much, but we generally try to increase them. We typically see that they go up in the 1 to 2% range in total per year, and that's kind of our target. Interfund charges, that includes a lot of things. One of the biggest components of that is the overhead number. Overhead is about $8 million per year, and that is what the general fund charges all the enterprise funds and other funds for the services that we provide out of the general fund. So the finance department, city administrator's office, city attorney's office, they're all housed within the general fund from a cost perspective. And to the extent we provide services to those other funds, we charge them through what's called the overhead. So we recover somewhere around 40% of our overall administrative costs through the overhead. The other number I wanted to point out is in terms of the revenue is the last one, which is the anticipated year-end variance. You can see that we're in the 2.3 to 2.4 range, $1 million. This, as a reminder, is what we believe in our estimate of what we expect to achieve every year in expenditure savings. We always have turnover in staff. We never have full staff in the general fund. We may have any point in time somewhere between 50 and 75 vacancies, and that provides savings to us. And it's usually at least our estimate on average of about $2.3 million. The last few years with high vacancies in library, community development, and police, that number has been as high as $5 million. But on an ongoing basis, particularly going forward, as we see these departments better, these vacancies going away, we have less vacancies now than we did last year or 2 years ago. We see that normalizing back to $2.3 million. On the expenditure side, you can see I just put salaries and benefits as one row and everything else in the other. The other expenditures I've kind of kept constant. They kind of have these one-time things coming in and out, but for the most part, I've assumed pretty constant expenditures, supplies and services, allocated costs, and the like. But salaries and benefits, you can see where we have it's the biggest number, and it's also where we see the biggest growth in 19 of about a 4.4% growth, in 20 of 3.8, and then 3.6 in 2021. It's about $4 million a year we see in terms of overall growth. And this was based on an assumed 1% per year growth in salaries. So because of that, there's a corresponding impact to other costs that are tied to salary, particularly retirement. And then toward the bottom, you'll see that obviously in 19, the white column in the middle is we're balanced, or we're proposing a balanced budget, save for the library issue we have to resolve still. Going forward, based on the assumptions on revenues in particular, and based on what we're forecasting on our cost side, based on a 1% salary increase, we're going to have a slight deficit, if you will. On an operating basis, you can see we're actually have a surplus to $493,000. Below that, you can see the capital program of 1.4. That's our typical capital expenditure, which is what's driving that the deficit. Not a big dollar amount. And then in 2021, it's growing slightly to $1.3 million. So the takeaway here is that essentially, we talk about revenue growth overall. Individually they vary, but in total, what we're seeing is around a 3% revenue growth. That's just not quite keeping up with our expenditure growth, assuming a 1% salary increase, and that's what's creating this deficit. So if we were to carry this forward over the next several years beyond 2021, those numbers would continue to get bigger and bigger. Questions on that piece? Okay. And then this is the other half of that forecast, if you will. This is on the reserves. What does all this mean to reserves? And the thing to keep in mind with reserves is that if, for example, next year we have a balanced budget, if we came in exactly as our budget and with no surplus, no deficit, from a reserve perspective, we would be behind because our reserves are a function of our budget. And I mentioned that our budget grows about $4 million per year. So every year we have to generate a surplus of $1 million just to stay even with our reserve policies, which is 25% of operating budgets. So, it puts a lot of pressure on our budget, if we will, and it sort of begs the question: why should we budget some kind of a number in there that says we need this at least to not only be balanced from an operating perspective, but to be balanced from a reserve perspective? But that's just with you for conversation. So just to kind of keep that in mind. So in 2019. Given that we're sort of starting the year with reserves above policy, at least for potentially reserves above policy at the end of this year, we will still be at policy in 19, assuming our numbers come in as we budgeted. But in 20, because we have this deficit compounded by the fact that we didn't generate that million or so in reserves to cover our growing policy requirements, we'd be showing a $1.2 million deficit in our reserves. And then it basically more than doubles in 2021 because, again, we're not generating the surplus to cover the growth, the natural growth in our reserve requirements. Plus, we have to add to that a $1.3 million deficit. So just to kind of give you the sense of how this plays out, the numbers are fairly small in terms of our deficits we're projecting in the next couple of years. But in terms of its impact on reserves, it's a little more magnified. Any questions on that piece? Pretty straightforward. And I can't, you indicated we didn't want to get into the pension discussion, but I can't really, it would be irresponsible of me to not get into the discussion of pensions in terms of what the forecast looks at, even though we kind of look at the next couple of years only. This is a problem that's going to, on a long-term basis, is going to be something we're challenged with. So we've seen this chart. The only addition to this chart is that the blue line at the bottom is kind of an adjusted number based on the cost-sharing formula we have with our general or our miscellaneous group, the non-safety folks that represent the largest group of all the employees. Because they have this cost-sharing formula, the rate that the city would be paying would be, instead of 49.5%, it would be 41%, because they would be picking up that incremental 8%. Today, they're picking up about 9 or 10% of their total overall costs. So by 2021, and this were to hold true, then they would be paying somewhere around 18 or 19%. And then once upon a time, not too long ago, I think the question was asked by Mr. Dominguez, what does that mean in terms of dollars? What are the costs going to be? I think I mentioned at a work session that some cities, based on a survey that the league did, that some cities would see a 100% increase in their PERS cost, dollar-wise, by 2025 when the discount rate is fully phased in. And this shows us based on what PERS has provided us, what those costs would be. And this is based, I wanted to kind of isolate the PERS increases from the salary increases. So if we gave no salary increases starting in 2020, because we built in a 1% this year and next year, but starting in 2020, if we gave no additional salary increases, this is what our costs would be citywide in the general fund. So today, the general fund in 18 is paying $23 million in retirement costs. That would grow to $37.3 million by 2025. It's a $14 million increase. It's about a 70% overall increase on a percentage basis. And citywide, about $29 million is what we're paying this year. That would grow to $47.2 million in 2025 for about an $18.2 million increase. So those are the numbers that, assuming no salary increases, so obviously these numbers will be impacted by by any increases above zero starting in 20. Some factors that could affect our actual results going forward, potential for recession. So the general fund, as you know, we rely, right or wrong, we rely on our tax revenues that are tied to tourism. We've historically see volatility in those revenues when a recession hits or when we have a strong recovery. We saw a major impact in 2007 and 8, but then we saw a strong recovery in TOT and even sales taxes in 2012 through 17. So we have volatility there. So when a recession hits, we can expect some further impacts or some impacts to some of our revenues that we're relying on. We are currently in the third longest expansion period that's following a recession in U.S. history. And this fall, if we were to continue on this trend, it would be the longest in history. Amazingly, nobody's forecasting, at least very few are forecasting a recession in the next year. Maybe not even the next couple of years, but certainly I think the economists will tell you that there's a really good chance in the next 3 years that we'd see a recession, and that would blow out, in terms of the longest expansion period. It'd be 13 years of expansion. Again, the longest right now is 10 years. And then the potential impacts of two bills that have been sponsored by Senator Glazer. This would have an impact on how current sales taxes collected through online sales would be distributed among the jurisdictions. So there will be winners and losers. The pie doesn't change in terms of size. It's just who gets the money. And it shifts what's called the situs, which becomes the basis for how things get allocated from the seller to the buyer. And what this means is that rather than looking at where the sales office is or where the distribution facilities are as the basis for allocating sales taxes, it would be shifted to where the product is delivered. So if for Amazon or other companies, right now it's based on where those orders are being fulfilled to a large extent, but this would mean that where product is delivered. Interestingly for us, if this were to become in effect, we would see a net loss in revenues. It'd be in the range of 200 to 700,000, very rough estimate. The cities that would really lose out are cities like city of Dinuba, who has invested substantially in building and bringing in large distribution facilities that are within the state, companies within the state, and they get all the sales taxes now. They indicated, I know at one meeting I went to, that if they weren't for the fact that they had these facilities and the way the current taxes are allocated, they would see their sales taxes cut in almost half. So they've invested on the premise that it's based on where the seller resides versus where it's delivered. So you can see statewide it becomes a kind of a tough discussion because there'll be a lot of winners and a few big losers. The other one is different than the redistribution of the sales taxes for online sales. This is really adding to the pie. This is making the pie bigger. This is the Wayfair versus South Dakota case. This is the case that's currently being held by the U.S. Supreme Court. I mentioned to you, I think not too long ago, this was kind of coming up. And it's revisiting the 1992 Quill case where North Dakota lost. They were wanting this catalog company that was out of state to collect sales taxes for those things that were being delivered into the state of North Dakota. They were unsuccessful. The Supreme Court said that no, that's not required, and that became the basis nationwide for why states like California can't force out-of-state companies who are selling products in the state of California from collecting sales taxes. Our consultants has indicated that we could potentially see $1.3 million per year. Other estimates are based on sort of per capita averages, put that at about $1.7 million. Not sure where this is going to land. I mean, I think at this point, based on some recent articles, it's more like a 50-50 chance whether this is successful or not in terms of our favor. But if we're fall in our favor, it would certainly be a big help to us. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions, or we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you both for that very comprehensive report. You spent a lot of time carefully examining those revenues coming up, and appreciate the level of detail. Or is there anyone in the public that'd like to speak to this item? Bonnie, would you mind going up to the microphone?
Because I'm not sure, how.
Ms. Raisin, could you make sure the microphone is on? Step one, could you check to make sure the microphone's on?
Sorry.
Thank you. There we go. Now you can go.
Under capital programs, does that include our infrastructure and the monies that came from the voters' passage of Measure C? I mean, capital means what?
Mr. Samario,
Yes.
maybe Ms. Raisin, you could ask your questions, and then we'll have a conversation about them up here, rather than just doing a one-on-one with the staff.
Oh, okay.
You're really looking at how are we accounting for the Measure C revenue,
And I got some of it a few weeks back, but missing from it was a huge, I mean, it was 22.5 million that was supposed to go into.
that's the estimated revenue that we'd be getting from this additional sales tax increase from Measure C on an annual basis. And your question is?
And my question is, out of that, it's going to eventually amount to 80 million plus, right, over a period of time? I mean, the
I
explanation.
guess it would depends on how long a period of time that you were projecting and at what growth rate you were projecting.
Yeah, well, I think what I'm asking for, and I think the people who voted for that would like to have a concise and easy to understand for the public how that money is going to be spent, and is it, I mean, I know it's not going to be, some of it is going to go to salaries and so forth, I assume, because it figured up to 16.8 million when I don't know, this was a while back, but just for clarification,
Sure.
is it, Public
Yeah,
Works?
I think we understand the question. Is that the whole question that you have? Okay.
Is this a question better posed to Public Works? I don't know.
Let's have Mr. Samario answer the question generally. Thank you.
Sure. So first, I just wanted to point out that on May 22nd, you had asked that we bring to you a discussion on the Measure C. So we'll be bringing to you on the 22nd how that $21 or $22 million is going to be planned to be spent for next year, on what project specifically, and it'll be a little bit duplicative of a presentation we have scheduled also on June 4th with the full council at one of the public hearings for the budget. So we'll be covering here in detail, and maybe to a less degree with full council. So that'll give you a good place for Ms. Raisin to attend and hear where the money's going to be spent. It is going to be, it's separate from what we talked about here, so it is going to come to the general fund, but we didn't put it in there, but it's going to be all for capital, so at this point, we're not intending to spend any of it on salaries. It's all going to be for infrastructure. And it is going to be about $21 million. There's no sunset, but over a 10-year period, that's $200 million. Over 20 years, that's $400 million or so. So those are the numbers we're talking about.
Thank you very much for that. Any additional questions for staff today? Councilmember Dominguez?
So the online sales, it's interesting that a couple of these outcomes could result in us having a revenue loss. I had thought it might go the other way. Is that because we sell a lot of online products that we're capturing revenue from?
I can do it if you want. Yeah, we before we got the number from our consultant, we were asking ourselves, would we win or lose in that regard? And it has to do with the proportion of folks who do online sales versus how the monies are being allocated. And I guess it turns out that we have more folks doing online transactions than our partnering agencies. Is that how would? Yeah.
So the online, a portion of the online sales, like for example, Amazon, is paid through the city to the city through a county pool, and so it's allocated out by by population, is it by per capita? Is that how they do it?
No,
Or is it by per sales tax?
Yeah.
Based on sales tax data. So it's based on sales tax data. So we had a big debate actually in our office whether we thought we would be a winner or a loser based on this change. And it is all about where those purchases are made. So whether there's a higher percentage of online purchases made within the city of Santa Barbara compared to other cities within Santa Barbara County, because it's all pulled together by the county and then allocated out to the individual cities. So it's just looking at the percentage of sales by the individual components of the county and comparing that to how it's already being allocated through the pool. And it turns out we actually would lose. And we didn't know until we actually contacted our consultant and said it could have gone either way. And it's, we didn't know. We didn't have the data on how the citizens within Santa Barbara were actually purchasing.
Yeah, I think what happens is because we're a tourist destination, we have a lot more sales taxes than like a Santa Maria does. So because of the way it's allocated, we get a share of any online transactions within the county based on how much sales taxes we get. And I think because that number is inflated to some degree, we're getting more than we otherwise would have based on where the transaction actually occurred.
Could you go to slide 25, please? And so it shows that our revenue, projected revenue for 18-19, 1.7%, 4.4%. And then it shows our growth in salaries and benefits, 5%, 4%. And then in 20, it's 2.7% revenue growth, 3.8% salary and benefit growth, and then 21, 2.4% revenue growth, and 3.6% salaries and benefits. So for 3 out of the 4 years, we're predicting that our expenditures are going to go up a lot more than our revenue in that particular category. So that seems troubling, and I don't know if there's a municipal finance way that can help us deal with that problem.
So just to kind of make sure you understand, so in 2020 and 21, those expenditures are using an assumed increase of salaries of 1% per year.
Right.
So to the extent that we did 0, for example, then we wouldn't have that same problem. If there were no salary increases, whether that's realistic or not, that's not for me to say. But so that's what's really driving this, because of the PERS cost, retirement costs on top of that is really the factor that's making those costs go up. Because a 1% salary increase typically wouldn't be that substantial, but because of the retirement costs, it's bigger. And it's also just being matched up with a time when our revenues, while not doing bad, aren't doing great. As I mentioned before, we typically are in the 3 or 4% overall growth rate on revenues from year. If you look historical averages the last 20 years, taking out the highs and lows, we're typically at least 3% overall revenue growth. And because salaries and benefits are not 100% of our overall cost, the other costs tend to be sort of stagnant. They tend to keep balanced. We end up in a sort of a balanced ongoing basis. But because we're soft in revenues, a little soft on some of the revenues and impacts of retirement, we're seeing this sort of out of balance, structural imbalance, if you will.
And our salaries and benefits are around 75-80% of our budget?
75-80%, that's correct.
And to go back to a previous answer, just to get clarification, Measure C, you said it's not accounted for in this because it's not part of the general fund. Did I understand that correctly?
No, it is part of the general fund. So we'll see, if you look at the budget that we just submitted, you'll see that there's one more row in the list of revenues. We call it Measure C. It's going to track essentially the same as our regular sales tax, or the 1% we're getting already. We didn't put into this because it's just sort of what you would see is a revenue of $22 million and an expenditure transferred out for capital for the same amount. So I'm not sure we needed it for our purposes. But the assumptions that go into what get that number are essentially the same. The only thing I will mention, and not to confuse the issue, is that any add-on sales taxes, which is what ours is, above the base of 1%, it goes to this destination approach for how sales taxes are allocated. So what's being proposed by Glazier is on the 1% base. It's already occurring on any add-on taxes, and that's what they wanted. Part of it was, let's just make them the same. So we may end up being slightly a winner on that because of that. So we may actually see our 1% for Measure C be slightly higher than what our base for 1% is because of that differential and how it's allocated, destination versus selling point. But that's the only difference. But they're going to be pretty close.
Great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you again, and we are adjourned.